Most people think civilizations rise or fall on the battlefield. We study decisive clashes, charismatic generals, revolutionary weapons, but more often than not, the true turning point was not a charge of cavalry or a breached wall. It was whether grain stayed dry. Entire empires have collapsed, not because they were outmatched in courage, but because their harvests rotted, their storehouses failed, or their supply lines stretched beyond what their granaries could sustain. When we talk about resilience, preparedness, and survival, we are really talking about storage, about systems built quietly, often decades before a crisis, that determined whether a population could endure drought, siege, or invasion. The granary was not just infrastructure, it was insurance against chaos, and in many cases it was the difference between continuity and collapse. The stability of early states depended less on conquest and more on controlled surplus. From Mesopotamia to the Nile Valley, early states were built on the management of agricultural surplus. Irrigation made surplus possible. Granaries made it usable. The shift from subsistence farming to centralized storage allowed rulers to collect grain as tax redistributed in lean years and feed labor forces for public works or armies. In ancient Egypt, state granaries were actually integrated into temple and palace complexes. Grain was carefully measured, recorded, and sealed. This was not merely economic administration, it was, in fact, strategic planning. You see, the Nile's flood cycle was predictable but, well, variable. A poor inundation meant hunger unless reserves had been accumulated ahead of time. Egyptian authority, in many periods, rested on the visible ability of the state to release grain during scarcity. Famine relief was not charity, it was, really, political legitimacy. When these systems faltered, during periods of low floods or political fragmentation, the consequences were, honestly, immediate. The first intermediate period shows how weakened central authority led to disrupted storage and distribution. Regional governors often hoarded supplies. Transportation networks deteriorated. The result was localized famine and social instability. It was not a dramatic invasion that triggered breakdown, but the erosion of administrative storage capacity. Sieges were won and lost long before the walls were tested. In classical antiquity, the capacity of a city to endure siege really depended on the depth and security of its granaries. A fortified wall without sufficient grain was, well, just a temporary obstacle, but with grain it became a strategic weapon. Athens during the Peloponnesian War offers a stark example. The city's long walls connected it to the port of Piraeus, ensuring maritime grain imports even when Spartan armies ravaged Attica. Athens did not rely solely on local harvests. It depended on a maritime supply network supported by storage facilities capable of holding imported grain from the Black Sea. When that supply was threatened, Athenian strategy shifted accordingly. Naval dominance was not abstract pride, it was in fact the protection of grain corridors. Conversely, during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, internal factionalism led to the burning of the city's own food stores before the Romans had fully encircled it. The destruction of granaries by rival groups removed any possibility of prolonged resistance. The military situation became irrelevant once internal food security collapsed. The Romans tightened the siege, but the decisive error had already been committed by those who undermined their own reserves. Over time, siegecraft evolved in response to storage practices. Medieval castles incorporated vaulted undercrofts and raised granaries designed to resist moisture and pests. Islamic cities developed sophisticated warehouse districts integrated with trade networks. The lesson was consistent: a fortress was only as strong as its food system. Climate shocks, really exposed which societies had actually planned for uncertainty. The late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE Well, it still remains debated, but evidence increasingly points to prolonged drought and climatic instability across the eastern Mediterranean. Palatial centers, like those in Mycenaean Greece and Hittite Anatolia, relied on these centralized storage economies. Grain was collected, stored in massive pithoi or magazines, and then redistributed. Archaeological layers, interestingly, show destruction and abandonment across multiple sites. In some regions, storage facilities appear to have been overwhelmed by repeated crop failures. Once surplus shrank, the administrative states that depended on redistributive control simply lost coherence. Trade networks faltered, armies could not be provisioned, and, well, internal unrest followed. The key point here is not that drought alone destroyed these societies, it's that their storage systems were just insufficiently resilient to prolonged multi-year stress. In contrast, regions that diversified their crops or maintained smaller, distributed storage seem to have adapted more effectively. Storage, in this context, was not just about capacity, but about redundancy and flexibility. A single harvest failure could usually be absorbed, but several in succession required deeper reserves and wider trade links. The granary, you might say, became a barometer of institutional foresight. Few states, understood the strategic importance of grain as clearly as Rome did. The Annona system ensured the steady import and distribution of grain, especially to the city of Rome itself. Egypt, after its annexation, became a critical supplier. The empire invested heavily in horrea, large ventilated warehouses built with raised floors and thick walls to protect against damp and infestation. These structures were not incidental. They were engineered for long-term preservation. Roman law actually regulated grain quality and storage conditions. Military granaries along frontier zones allowed legions to campaign without immediate dependence on local harvests. This logistical depth enabled Rome to project power far from Italy. When grain shipments were disrupted by piracy, rebellion, or political instability, the effects were immediate. Urban unrest in Rome often followed supply shortages. Emperors understood that maintaining grain reserves was central to maintaining order. Overextension in later centuries strained this system. As territories fragmented and tax collection faltered, maintaining large-scale storage and transport became more difficult. The decline of centralized grain logistics mirrored the empire's political contraction. Once again, structural resilience proved more decisive than battlefield prowess. In imperial China, particularly during the Han and later dynasties, state-sponsored granary systems were developed explicitly to stabilize prices and prevent famine. The ever-normal granary concept aimed to buy grain in times of abundance and release it during shortages, moderating market fluctuations. These were not ad hoc relief efforts. They were institutionalized policies grounded in Confucian governance principles. The legitimacy of the state was tied to its ability to prevent starvation. Local officials were evaluated partly on how well they maintained reserves. When these systems functioned, they reduced the risk of peasant uprisings driven by hunger. But, when corruption, mismanagement, or natural disaster undermined them, rebellion followed. The Yellow Turban Rebellion in the late Han period was fueled in part by economic distress linked to food insecurity. The lesson repeated across centuries, food storage was a preventative defense against internal collapse. It was quieter than a standing army, but often more effective. Even into the early modern period, lessons drawn from ancient storage practices influenced military planning. During protracted conflicts such as the 30 Years' War, armies that relied solely on foraging devastated civilian populations and destabilized entire regions. States gradually moved toward magazine systems, centralized depots stocked in advance to sustain campaigns. This transition marked a recognition that ad hoc supply was strategically unsound. Napoleon's campaigns, though famous for rapid maneuver, also revealed the limits of living off the land. In Russia in 1812, scorched earth tactics destroyed local stores, leaving the Grande Armée without sustenance. The Russian strategy relied less on battlefield annihilation and more on denying stored resources. Modern military logistics, with its emphasis on secure supply chains and reserve stockpiles, has roots in these older lessons. The principle remains consistent. Preparedness is measured not in days of supply, but in structured capacity to absorb disruption. Across these examples, a pattern emerges. Civilizations that invested in durable, well-managed storage systems could withstand shocks that would otherwise prove fatal. Those that neglected maintenance, allowed corruption, or centralized without redundancy faced sharper crises. Granaries were expressions of long-term thinking. They required labor in times of abundance for benefits that might not be realized for years. They demanded administrative discipline and technical knowledge, ventilation, pest control, moisture management. They also required social trust. Populations had to believe that stored grain would be fairly redistributed in hardship. For survival-minded observers today, the lesson is structural rather than romantic. Resilience is rarely dramatic. It is built incrementally through systems that appear mundane in times of stability. The failure of those systems, however, becomes visible only when stress arrives. The story of ancient granaries is not as visually striking as that of sieges or conquests, yet without them, few of those events would have unfolded as they did. Storage capacity shaped strategy, politics, and survival across millennia. When we examine the past through the lens of logistics rather than legend, we see that endurance rests on preparation. The societies that survived were not always the strongest in combat. They were often the most disciplined in planning for scarcity. Understanding these overlooked systems deepens our view of history. It reminds us that resilience is engineered long before it is tested. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, where we examine the structures that quietly shaped civilizations, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts and sharing this video with others who appreciate serious, grounded history.